What?
It's time now for My Two Favorite Librarians, brought to you by the Copper Tree Boutique in Dales Grand Market, located in beautiful, historic downtown Amherst.
Hi, this is My Two Favorite Librarians. I'm still not Denise Corey. I'm Chantel Taylor, and joining me again is Adam Davies.
Hello.
And today we're talking about mythology
Yes.
and legends. Very exciting.
Yes.
I can't wait to see what you bring to the table this week, Adam. Okay, so first we'll get business out of the way. Then we'll talk about mythology.
Right.
So very exciting this week. Our libraries are going to be reopening almost to full hours. But what that means is we're going to be going back up in hours. It means that grab-and-go branches like Advocate and Pugwash are now going to be open for people to go in and look at their collections. So check our website. We'll have the new hours up, and you can give your local branch a call as well. But very exciting to almost be back to full hours.
Absolutely.
Website address is www.cumberlandpubliclibraries.ca. Check us out for our hours. Okay, on to mythology. So, Adam, we can go a couple ways with this.
Okay.
So, you can get actual books about mythology and about Greek, well, I shouldn't say Greek gods, but gods and goddesses from all different...
All over the world, spanning the globe.
You can have retellings
Yes.
of myths and legends in a modern version where the names are changed, or like, I don't know, sometimes they're not even real gods and goddesses, but they have this thread of like whatever legend or myth. And there was a third thing, and now it's gone from my mind. Adam?
I'm not sure if it was what you were thinking of, but the one that I am intrigued by is how many times a lot of the mythologies are now being presented to people in a different format. And this is especially exciting here in Eastern Canada because just a couple of years ago, the National Film Board did Mi'kmaq legends and myths. And the one that is the most interesting one is an illustrated story done by Alan Sillaboy from Thundermaker. But the McDonagh, the Stormmaker, that story was told by Neptune Theatre. It's about a 13-minute display. It's available online. It's available on the National Film Board site. I think the Neptune Theatre has it on their website. And it's just a fantastic introduction to Mi'kmaq legends and myths, largely because we don't know a lot of those stories.
It's true.
And it's a very easily accessible, and it is so well done. It's just bringing a whole other artistic dimension to how you tell those stories.
So I should say right off the bat, we're pretty biased because now you were very smart and you were like, oh, Mi'kmaq, yeah, we have to bring that. Yeah, we should be bringing that in. But of course, naturally, and I said it, I goofed it right off the top, Greek and Roman mythology. But that's not all that's out there.
No, the interesting one, and one of the names that will come up is Rick Riordan is promising to do a story about Irish mythology. And Celtic mythology is an interesting, it's had sort of a revival, I guess would be the way to describe it. It's become, we're much more familiar with it. We've moved beyond just the stories of the Banshee out of Irish myth, and we're kind of a little bit more familiar with the stories, but they are a very different story than what you get from Greek and Roman. It's not specifically about the creation, it's really about the diabolical deeds of gods and demigods and the mythology about creation and differences in the world and how that's done. And it is a more brutal version than you see in some of the Greek myths. I think that would be the way to describe it.
Let's talk about Rick Riordan. I talked about him last week. I'm currently re-listening to Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief, which is the first in his Percy Jackson and the Olympians. Couldn't remember the series last week, but he has really made a fantastic little cottage industry for himself. He started off with the Greek myths, and I was saying last week he and his son were reading them for bedtime stories. His son loved them and he wanted more, so Rick Riordan wrote some and then took them into his junior high class to like get them to sort of edit so he could get some like humor cues and what they thought was funny and what they thought was interesting. So he's done the Greeks and the Romans and the Asgardians. And I feel like there's another one he's done.
The Egyptians.
The Egyptians.
The Kane Chronicles.
And then you said he might be moving on to Celtic as well. So he's made a very entertaining series for himself. And these are good books. Like, they're funny and they're well written. And I think I, as a kid, really loved mythology. And I read a lot of those, like, just plain old, like, we didn't really have a lot of stories of myths and legends as, like...
We had the polished ones that came out of the 19th century, the early 20th century. I can think of one cover where it's Greek heroes. The stories are heavily illustrated.
Yeah.
And it's very comfortable, easy books, but I think you have that switch. It's very simple stories, and then when you get a little bit older, you read that the stories are much more violent than we learned.
Yeah, as kids.
The characters are much more complex. They're not the one-dimensional characters anymore, and that's a fascinating part of mythology, is how the elements, you can pull so many different elements from it.
Also, when we were searching for this, and I'll post some of the book lists that I use, because I use, of course, Book Riot a lot. They had a couple of different lists about what mythology books you should read. There are a ton of books being written for teens. Yes. Where they're retelling myths, or they're like modernizing them and retelling them with different names, so you don't really understand that it's like, it's magical realism, I guess we could put it in that sense.
Broad fantasy.
Yeah. And then you also have like actual retellings of like Hades and Persephone, where it's physically them, as opposed to John Hayden and Pierce Olivier, who's like, anyway, there's like an absolute plethora of books that are based on some sort of mythology. We didn't have that as kids.
We didn't. We had a lot of the guidebooks.
Yeah, the dry encyclopedia books.
And that is one of the books I brought today because it's so good on this point, is the Basher History, the mythology, Oh My Gods and Goddesses, which takes a view of the classic gods that we know from Greek and Roman mythology, and it brings in Norse mythology. It also brings in Egyptian mythology and others as well. The great thing about this series that's different than what we may have read before, and this is really a book targeting juvenile readers, is that it's told from the first person. So the story of Aphrodite is her describing herself as the ultimate surfer girl. I was born out of the sea foam, riding a sea scallop, I caught a wave to shore. It also gives the highlights of what is attached to her myths, so where the Venus de Milo comes from and why that's important. Her role in the beginning of the Trojan War, the plants that were sacred to her, and most conveniently, two things. One is a pronunciation guide. Aphrodite rhymes with mighty. They do that for all the gods and goddesses, and that extremely helpful. The other one is a pairing. Aphrodite in Roman mythology is Venus, and this book highlights that all the way through, who the Roman counterparts are.
So the Basher guides, we have a bunch of them. It's an amazing, amazing series. So there's like science and
chemistry, periodic table, math, algebra. They've done dinosaurs. They've done elements of history, so American history. And the mythology one was the one I highlighted.
So it's an amazing little series. It's got really cute little graphics. So they're almost kind of like, they're not quite anime, but they're really cutesy graphics, which would be really sort of maybe not so scary when you're handing a book. Like, here's a book about mythology to kids who may be like, So that is a great example of a book strictly like informational, who these people are. Well, they're not real people, but who these gods and goddesses are and what they did, what we should be reading about them.
Yes.
There's mythology for all ages.
Yes.
So I've got in front of me a couple of board books by Joan. I don't know if I'm pronouncing her name correctly or not, because it's the same woman that does the Goddess Girls. Halhoub?
I think it's Halhoub.
Halhoub. So mini myths are for like babies, and it's like brush your hair, Medusa, and be careful, Icarus. And like with Icarus, he's flying a bird kite, and it's like, be careful, don't spill, be gentle with it. I can fly it, don't get it caught in the trees. And so it's like all these really simple sort of very basic elements of the Icarus myth stripped down to something that a little kid could understand. I have to be careful with my toys or I'm going to break them. I can't always be the most helpful person. Sometimes it's fun to play in the paints, but you're not always being helpful to mom and dad. And
these have a fantastic wink to adult readers who know a little bit about the story. We know that Icarus does have, as so many characters in mythology do, there's a little bit of tragedy in his life.
Yes,
And
yeah.
there's a wink to that the way through. Same with Medusa. It's a reference to Medusa, but we know how that story ends, and it's not a great ending.
So Icarus's bird kite ends up in the trees. And of course, you see Dad saying, be careful, be careful. And then it gets stuck. And Dad says, don't worry, we can fix it. And Icarus is saying, oh, can we try to fly it again?
On a nice sunny day, we're going to put a little bit of wax on it. It'll be great. It's going to turn out so well.
So on the back it says, a mythology-inspired modern-day parable for the young and the young at heart. So those are great ones for little kids. And they have like Hercules and King Midas. And I can't remember, there's a bunch of them.
Yes.
So those are called mini myths. And also by Joan Halub are the Goddess Girls. And this is a series. It's a juvenile series. So
Yes.
what age group would you say? Like 8 to 12?
The characters are 10, 11, 12 at that stage. So
the first book in the series was called Athena the Brain. And I think this is a genius series because she's basically taken these gods and goddesses and put them in junior high, which is basically like Hades in an actual like physical form. So like there's the mean girls and there's the nerds and there's the jocks. And so of course we all have those sort of archetypes from our movies, from our books. And so this is like totally relatable for, I think, like preteens and tweens.
And I've only admittedly dipped into bits and pieces of these books. I'm looking at book 25 in the series. The one thing that is interesting is it's not a one and done with Athena. She reappears in the story in different contexts. So you have Athena the Brain, Athena the Wise, and then other characters come in. So it moves beyond just the gods and goddesses. Pandora is here. Persephone appears a couple of times. And the last one, number 25, I'm looking at is Clotho, the Fate. The story of why mortals do not necessarily get the fate that they want.
Yeah,
reading the blurb on the back.
Which is a lesson. How many times a day do you say to your son, Adam, who told you life was fair?
Exactly.
So although a lot of people are maybe looking at these and thinking like, why are they relevant for today? They are still relevant and put into like a modern context or sort of reformulated for kids and teens and adults. They are actually very interesting reads, and they are stories that have like stood the test of time.
Yes.
People are still reading the Odyssey and the Iliad.
And the one that comes to series is Stephen Fry, within the past 3 years, did a Mythos series, was the first one, and then it was Heroes. And this is Stephen Fry who's repackaged and redone the myths, and he's given it some sense of chronological order, but he's put in a lot of dramatic flair. It's one thing to read the books, it's another to hear him perform it. And he did I know he was in Ontario a couple of years ago, the Shaw Festival, where he was doing 3 nights of this, where it was each book he was basically performing, or a large part of each book that he was performing. And this is one where it's really revitalizing the stories, it's revitalizing the tales, but it's also giving it such a humorous twist. Stephen Fry brought in all the naughty bits, if we want to describe them that way, of mythology. All the gruesome bits are put back in, and it's Stephen Fry reading it. If you can get a hold of the audio version, which we do have in our collection, it's astonishing to listen to it. It's just so well done, and it gives you a sense of why these stories resonate for so long. And really, he's getting to the point of mythology, is that mythology talks about the big things. Where are the creation myths? Why are there so many differences in the world? What are the consequences of those differences? It's not like legends, where legends are kind of looking for that there's a little bit of fact somewhere. It's the legend of King Arthur because there's a historical Arthur that we're looking at. This is going beyond that. This is really looking at the big ideas of where we come from and where we're going.
So, 15 Dogs by Andre Alexis, which was Canada Reads. Was it Canada Reads? It was some sort of...
I think it was Canada Reads.
It was some sort of, not prize winner, but like something that people really enjoyed. I think it won Canada Reads, didn't it?
It's interesting because Canada Reads, they also had Son of Trickster, which was another one. Now that's kind of leaning a little bit... I'm not sure if that's mythology or legend. It's kind of in this interesting...
Because we think of Loki as the trickster, but there's also tricksters in a lot of Aboriginal.
Yes. And this is the one that CBC is turning into this series, which starts early October.
One of Denise's favorite books. She loved trickster, and I can't think of who the author is. I may have to Google that.
Oh, yeah. This is the test portion.
So 15 dogs, going back to Andre Alexis.
Yes.
So that is like, I think it's Apollo and Hermes
Yes.
that are sort of there. Madeline Miller in the last few years has come out with Song of Achilles, and the big one that was just out last year was Circe.
Yes, I can picture the cover of it
Yeah,
now.
I can picture the cover as well. And those are sort of like retellings of mythology. They're not put in any sort of modern setting.
Right.
They're just slightly changing. And then, of course, Margaret Atwood had
There was the whole series that was done with world myths, and they revitalized it they had Irish authors involved with that. Margaret Atwood did one. There was one on the story of Mulan that was done by...
Would we consider Mulan? I guess it would
it's
kind of be a legend, wouldn't it?
It's a legend, but what's interesting is it has elements of mythology drawn into it.
Sherry Thomas did the Ballad of Mulan.
Okay. And that was that whole series, and that was a few years ago now of how many they picked up in that.
I was thinking of Margaret Atwood, Penelope.
Yes. The Odyssey told from the story of Ulysses told from the other perspective.
Yeah, from his wife.
So poor Penelope left at home, waiting for 20 years.
How do you pronounce it? Penelopad?
Yes.
Penelope.
The take on the Iliad and the Odyssey, taking it to a Greek form and telling from her perspective, which is one of the fascinating things that come up in mythology, because one of the other books I brought with me today was Neil Gaiman's Norse mythology. And this is one where there are slightly different perspectives coming in. It's slightly different voices that are being used. He's giving... The hardest thing in Norse mythology is trying to create a continuous narrative that goes all the way through, because the sources for Norse mythology are spread far and wide. You have some in Denmark, some coming out of Sweden, Norway. You have some of the Icelandic sagas and tales that draw upon the same tradition, the same oral tradition that as it's being written down. And a large time mythology was written down by a lot of monks and a lot of ones coming from a Christian tradition who didn't see the value of this, and they would either Christianize these stories or make the people in the stories particularly bad, always the villains of the piece. So in this, Neil Gaiman tries to change that around a little bit. He's giving it some sense of continuity. He's giving it some sense of what we're picking up as the most famous bits we know of Norse mythology, and giving it a much wider context.
Because, of course, Thor has been brought back into our consciousness. Thank you, Marvel movies.
Yes.
So you have Thor and Loki sort of sparking perhaps an interest in Norse mythology.
Heimdall, the Bifrost, the whole thing.
That's right.
It's now a larger part of our cultural bearing. The other thing, and I'll just mention about Neil Gaiman because it's a fascinating aspect of when he writes about mythology, is we have American Gods, which is a book that's almost 20 years old since it was first published. It's
very interesting. Didn't like the book, but very interesting concept.
The concept is he took what was essentially a version of Ragnarok. If we think of Mr. Wednesday as Odin wants to destroy so many of the gods to start over again. But what Neil Gaiman did, and it's not giving away anything in the book, I hope, is he introduced a whole element of new gods to go along with
that.
So you had Tech Boy, and I had to make a list, Tech Boy, Media, the Intangibles, which were the gods of the stock market, Mr. World, which was globalization, and there was also goddesses like cosmetic surgery and gods for each one of the drugs.
And it really does make sense when you think about like how the world has changed and what's important to us right now in this world. Those gods, and I'm not mocking anyone's religion by saying this, but they really are things that we as a society worship. Like, it's a really interesting idea to have like those old gods kind of fading away and these new weird fancy gods like taking their place.
Yes.
It is a really fascinating concept.
I think the series, because it became a television series on Starz, and I think the benefit was there had been such a long gap, like 18 years between when the book was published and when the series came out. And it gave the series a whole new perspective and a whole new audience, because they could make some profound changes from the book to reflect what was happening now. And it really served it well. I think when the book was first published, there was a lot of comparisons to the work from Discworld, The Small Gods, and that aspect of it. I think now with the series, it's much more it's still fantasy, but it's much more of a grounded fantasy and mythology, and it's grounded fantasy coming out of some urban traditions. It speaks a lot, just watching the series, slave gods, the gods that were in Annecy coming out of Africa, and that whole, it wasn't as well done in the book as it was in the series of how important that deity was and how important that mythology was. It's fascinating.
Because, again, we said right off the top, we're very biased in because, there have to be African gods and like Latin American gods that we just don't really get into our culture, especially up here in Canada. I wonder if in the U.S. they have...
I think in the U.S. there's more of an awareness, especially Annecy, a spider god, and it's one that I remember Marvel.
Okay, so you've just pronounced that not the way that I've heard it pronounced, and I didn't realize what you were talking about because, of course, I've done that puppet show like 100 times.
Okay, so what's the...
Well, now I can't say it. Anansi. That's the way...
Okay. Well, again, this is...
Well, potato. We never rehearse. That's what makes it delightful for Ron when he has to edit all this out.
Yes.
But, that didn't even clue into me that, of course I know who that guy is.
The pronunciation, because I think of... There was a follow-up book of the Anansi boys, in which it was this fascinating story of where Anansi dies, and his children then, or their children have to find out that they're gods. And it's kind of a follow-up to American Gods. It comes a little bit longer in the mythology. I haven't read all of it. It was one that really got into.
You can't read everything, Adam.
I know I really got into it, and then it wasn't for no fault of the book. Just kind of fell off the radar for a while. So it's sitting at home on a shelf with a bookmark in it.
So no matter what your age,
yes,
you can find some little nugget of mythology in something you're reading. We can still learn things from these myths. They still have some valuable information to tell us without it being like preachy in a way. And I guess that's the point of them. It's these stories where someone has had a tragedy, and it's like, oh, if you don't do these things, like Icarus, again, because I'm sitting here looking at Icarus, if you don't fly too close to the sun, however you interpret that, because obviously we don't fly, but we can get too big for our britches, which is really what it means. And we can still use those lessons. So there are really great stories. When I was working in reference in Halifax, one of the ladies was looking up a question. I came onto my shift, and she was looking for something, I believe, on the Elysian Fields. And she was looking through all these Christian dictionaries and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, oh, that's Greek. The Elysian Fields are where the good people went and the soldiers went. And so she was looking at him. She's like, oh, how did you know that? And I was like, oh, Xena, warrior princess.
we haven't, because that's one of the great things of when we think of mythology. One is obviously Xena comes to mind. Also have to mention the Black Cauldron. That was Disney's first PG animated film that they did. It was the first one that had a little bit of computer animation, and this was based on a very dark bit of Welsh mythology. And it's fascinating. It was never one of the highest rated or best performing Disney films, but they took on what is a very dark story about an enchanted cauldron and how if you control the cauldron, you have the power of rebirth and you can therefore take over the world. It's much better than I just explained it. But it is one that so much of our entertainment is based on elements of mythology coming through.
It really is. There's so the list of you can find podcasts. I didn't even get to mention there's a bunch of podcasts out there that deal with mythology. I listened to one called Let's Talk About Miss Baby, and of course she sings it like Salt and Pepper.
Two things we can add to that quickly is Twitter has become a fantastic venue for groups to relay the stories of myth, and they do it as tweets. There's also a fantastic one from BBC Wales where they told the story of Mabinogion as a group chat.
Nice.
Very short, very punchy, but it's all of the high points of the myth told in the form of a group chat, which makes it immediately accessible to a whole other audience.
I also found a webcomic when I was doing my research for this, and I've gone down that rabbit hole. I spent all of last night flipping through, and of course it's episodes. So I think she's been doing it for years. I think it's up to 120 episodes, and I'm on 25.
Right.
So anyway, I'm loving that. We're starting to run long now, Adam.
It's such a...
It's a big topic.
We didn't even get to Naruto. We didn't get the stuff coming out of Japanese mythology and Japanese religion, if we want to call it in the broad sense, traditional Japanese religion of Inuyasha.
Graphic novels.
Graphic novels that draw heavily upon, especially the dark side or the death aspects of Japanese and Asian mythology. Death Note's a perfect example of that. Naruto is, the entire series is based basically on that idea.
So myths and legends are everywhere. Everywhere.
Do we miss any other ones to mention?
Of course we did, Adam. We missed a ton of stuff. But the point is, we'll post some lists on our My Two Favorite Librarians page. Denise really has this down to a science, and I'm not good at it. But you can join us on Instagram, on Facebook, and on Twitter. Our website is www.cumberlandpubliclibraries.ca. Adam, do you know what we're talking about next week?
Is it more, are we going into, I don't know, historical fiction is going to be my guess.
No, you're way off the mark.
Way off. Cookbooks.
No, I wish we were talking about cookbooks. So next week we're going to be talking about mental health.
Interesting.
And I'll be interested to see, because I know Denise likes a good self-help book. I do not. But just the act of reading itself is a mental health booster. Yes. So stay tuned next week. Hopefully, not that I don't enjoy talking to you, Adam. Denise will be back from her illness. We'll see you next week.
Take care.
My Two Favorite Librarians, brought to you by the Copper Tree Boutique in Dales Grand Market, located in beautiful, historic downtown Amherst.